Hello, it's Tom Jordan. Nice to have you here. It is a Wednesday, and you probably read a lot of headlines about suddenly, like the New York Times, Donald Trump wants to take over the world, and these are his first steps of doing so. We're talking about this. It's a pretty bold, global strategy. We're talking about this strategic vision to protect the Western Hemisphere. But some say, is he serious here? Or is he trolling? So we're talking about, making all these waves. Donald Trump is by targeting the Panama Canal, Greenland, and even suggesting that Canada should be the 51st state of the United States of America. Is it just trolling? Is this maybe a calculated push to strengthen U.S. dominance, to protect our national interests in the region? Well, we're going to get into that in a moment here, but I want to give you kind of a brief background here. Greenland, Panama, Canada. What is this all about? So there's the Panama Canal, obviously. Donald Trump sees Chinese influence down in Panama as a direct threat to the United States' interests. Panama's president disputes Donald Trump's claims, but with China really managing two major ports and heavily investing in the region, Donald Trump's call for U.S. control again in Panama really does align well with protecting Western Hemisphere security. Not to mention the fact that we built the Panama Canal. We lost, I believe, hundreds of thousands of American lives in building it, and we gave it away for $1 back in the Jimmy Carter administration. What about Greenland? All right, so Greenland is rich in resources. It's a strategic area. It's key to the Arctic geopolitics. So Donald Trump is labeling Greenland's acquisition a necessity to do what? To counter China and to counter Russia, who have growing influence in the region. And despite the Danish resistance, Denmark, this is a territory of Denmark. Denmark has control over Greenland, a little tiny country. I think it's the size of South Carolina. They have control over Greenland. And so, but despite that, Donald Trump's push revives Americans' focus on Arctic strategy. Heavily important. All right, Canada. What about our neighbor to the north? Well, Trump's talk, his rhetoric on Canada becoming a U.S. state, it's kind of blending humor with his strategic intent. He's got proposed tariffs at 25%. Very critical of Justin Trudeau. The pressure he's put on Justin Trudeau was really what has led to Justin Trudeau's demise in Canada. But he's talking about trade and crime and these energy policies that have a direct impact on the United States. So he's talking a lot about that. So the whole strategy here is reflecting Donald Trump's commitment to reviving what's known as the Monroe Doctrine, the principles of that, prioritizing U.S. security and dominance over foreign influence in our region. Something we started in the 1800s to protect us from foreign adversaries in the Western Hemisphere. So Donald Trump's team is framing this as, securing American strength and respect around the globe, which we have lost. Joe Biden's administration, we have lost a lot of the respect that we once had. For our great nation across the world. So we need to gain that back. And how do you do that? Well, this may be part of the bold ideas. It's bold leadership. Some people are saying it's a calculated bluff to reset the global chessboard, as they say. Either way, Donald Trump's vision is reshaping the conversation, and it's a good thing to do this. So we're going to get into that in just a moment here with my guest from Hillsdale College, Dr. Miles Smith, a history professor at Hillsdale, knows a lot about these geopolitics regarding these three major important issues. Just want to remind you to comment today. I'd like to hear from you. You can chime in. You can even ask questions in the comment sections. I'll get to those in just a moment, wherever you're watching, be it on Facebook, on X, or on YouTube. Put your comments and questions there. We'll get to those in just a bit. Okay, so Donald Trump calling out China's growing dominance over the Panama Canal, this vital trade route that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. China's managing two of Panama's 5 main ports. They're managing it, and they're heavily investing in that region. And Donald Trump's arguing, listen, the United States is being sidelined while paying exorbitant fees to use a canal in the first place. It once controlled that canal, and now we got to pay a ton of money. And China is reaping a lot of the benefits as a result of that. Probably the greatest threat to the United States. As Christopher Wray from the FBI just said to Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes the other day, he reiterated that point. The threat that China poses to the United States are just south of us, controlling a big portion of the Panama Canal. Donald Trump's focused on the Panama Canal, on Panama, the country, on Greenland, and on Canada. It's a return to the principles of the Monroe Doctrine, keeping these foreign powers at bay, especially these adversaries like China and Russia. Get them out of the Western Hemisphere. What are they doing here in the first place? They want to overthrow the United States. So Donald Trump's vision challenges this decades of a very passive U.S. policy that allowed these rivals to expand their influence in America's backyard. Greenland is a great place. It's rich in natural resources. It's vital to the Arctic geopolitics there. It's become a focal point for, countering Russia and Chinese ambitions in the region. So Donald Trump declaring that the United States ownership or influence in that region is absolutely necessary, and it does reflect his commitment to securing America's energy and military interests. This is not a situation like the New York Times is pointing out that these are the first few steps of Donald Trump trying to overtake the world. That's not what's happening here. It's a ridiculous statement, and I think they know it, but they're putting that out there anyway. This is not a dictator. This is democracy, democratic republic principles, in order to protect the United States and actually set other people free as well. And you look at Canada, the high taxes that are over there, it's holding them back, it's holding us back. And he even quipped the other day, you probably saw this, that Wayne Gretzky, a Canadian, maybe Wayne Gretzky could be the governor of Canada if Canada becomes the 51st state of the United States of America. People were laughing about it. Some people thought he was being serious. It's humor, but the point is to bring up a very serious issue just north of the United States. The canal, Panama, is a very serious issue. Deep concerns about how China's investments and control over those key ports are undermining the United States. And by floating the idea of U.S. control, he is advocating for a return to policies that prioritize America's economic and security interests. So every move here, it might seem audacious, but they reflect a larger strategy to put America first in trade and in security and in global influence. What's wrong with that? That's, I think, every country's ideal. I spoke just a few moments ago with Dr. Miles Smith IV, a assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College. Here's our conversation. Dr. Miles Smith IV is an assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College joining me now. So nice to have you, Doctor. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, you, Tom. Appreciate it.
This is a very interesting topic. I know it's controversial, the Donald Trump claim that he wants to, take back the Panama Canal. He wants to, I don't know if he's serious about Canada, but it seems in certain comments that he potentially is. But then Greenland is also a very strategic locale for the United States. It'd be great to have, I guess, but all these things are kind of like, is this even, possible? We're kind of scratching our heads as we hear and see these comments coming out of the president-elect's mouth. Generally speaking, before we get into the nitty-gritty, what's your feeling about what is happening? And are all these things equal? The Panama Canal, Canada, and Greenland?
Well, there's always been a tradition in the United States of basically looking at other countries that we perceive as not really having full flourishing of liberty and saying, America should go in and kind of order that country or either administer it or even conquer it and give those people kind of the full sort of freedoms that we know and love here. And so there's a long tradition of that, really starting in the 1830s. You can find it was stronger in the Democratic Party than what becomes the Republican Party, incidentally. It's always been more of a Democratic talking point. And I think the president-elect's sort of DNA is sort of blue dog Democrat from New York City. So that's not unusual. What's probably unusual is that the press is sort of taking and running with these what seems to be bluster, sort of strategic bluster from Trump. I think I remember people saying we should take him seriously, but not literally. And so I think this is another moment where the press probably needs to take him seriously, but not literally. I don't think the president wants to invade Canada or Greenland. I do think that there is something to be said for his comments about the canal zone. So I think that if the press were really smart, they would take each case case by case and sort of look at the merits of what Mr. Trump's doing. But as usual, we have a sensational press, and so
Yes.
we're sort of just taking comments and sort of hearing the worst possible scenarios in each of them.
Right. It's very shameful, actually. I'll read headlines like, this is Donald Trump's first stage at world dominance. And this is like New York Times, saying these kinds of things. And we know that's not really the case. So we get into the nitty gritty of it. So let's start with the Panama Canal. That was something that I was concerned about that as you look back and we kind of forget what happened in the 1970s and Jimmy Carter selling it back for $1. Was that a mistake? And should we maybe take that back somehow?
Yeah, it was an enormous mistake, and I think it just displays the sort of way in which Jimmy Carter always thought he was doing Sunday school as politics. We weren't being nice by having the Panama Canal, and so we needed to give it back to the people who rightfully, in his mind, should administer it, and that was Panama. The thing to remember, of course, is Panama wasn't sort of a real country. The United States instigated a revolution in Colombia in the beginning of the 19th century. Precisely so, a group of people who self-identified as Panamanians would create the Panamanian Republic and give the United States rights to the Canal Zone, which we had for the better part of a century and administered very well. And it was good for the United States to administer the Canal Zone because it's obviously a major geopolitical transit point. The idea that somehow it would have been better in someone else's hands has sort of roots in a sort of, unfortunately, very American sort of self-loathing that a certain sort of moralist pietist like Jimmy Carter had. And it also displayed his inability to think strategically. So I think giving the Canal Zone back was an enormous mistake. It's much harder for us to retrofit the canal than it once was. It's much harder for us to basically make repairs on the canal than it once was. The United States doesn't even have immediate jurisdiction over those repairs or retrofitting anymore. So I do think it was a huge mistake.
Yeah, you're setting aside the fact that, the United States invested heavily in the Panama Canal and the construction of it and the thousands of American lives that were lost I think hundreds of thousands of lives lost during that construction period. Setting that aside, who is strategic, unlike Jimmy Carter, is China. And they have now essentially wielded an immense amount of influence and leverage by their investment in Panama. And you look at what they've done now with the Panama Canal, they're controlling what, two major ports right now down there, and they wield huge influence over the canal that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific. And Christopher Wray just came out the other day again saying that the biggest threat to the United States is the country of China. So if I don't know what the obstacles are of reclaiming the Panama Canal, but if we do so, what challenges lie ahead for the United States in pushing back against the influence that China now wields over Panama in that region?
I think some of it goes back to American policymakers and the American people are sort of very afraid to be an empire. We don't like to talk about empire. We sort of shrink from the language of empire because empire sounds bad. In some ways, you have to sort of understand that from the very beginning of the Republic, Americans thought of themselves as an empire. Alexander Hamilton uses that language in Federalist One. Excuse me. Thomas Jefferson calls the United States an empire of liberty. So we really have to ask the question of philosophy of history. There will always be empires. There's always has been empires. I think what the United States needs to get comfortable with is asking the question of whose empire do you want running the Western Hemisphere? The United States's, or what's essentially a Stalinist fascist ethno-state in China. And so if the strategic decisions were put to the people that way, I think you'd have more people willing to say, you know what, maybe the United States does need to flex its muscles hemispherically in a way that we're not comfortable with. And some of that would take rethinking our relatively small military establishment at present. The military is a lot smaller than it was during the Cold War. And so, yeah, there are a lot of, as you've said, obstacles. But I don't think those are impossible to overcome. I think especially a president like Trump has been able to move the needle on a lot of policy substantively. And so I think if he's interested in it, he'll be able to move the needle on this stuff as well.
I think it'd be nice to have larger hemispheric muscles. I used to have those in my 20s, but they've gone away as I've aged. Just kidding, obviously. But the empire. I think the definition of that really had this evil connotation since George Lucas came in, and that's how we think of it.
Mm.
The Star Wars, the evil empire is taking over. But I think it's a very good point you make regarding that. So we look at that, and then we look at Greenland. I mean, I know there's been attempts, and I think Harry Truman try to negotiate getting Greenland as a part of the United States. And nowadays, empire sounds like we're trying to take over the world, but Greenland is very strategic. I mean, it's mineral rich. It's in this area where Russia has all these potential. I don't know. They have submarines and ships in that region and whatnot. There is a lot of threat in that place, and it could be advantageous towards the United States if we were somehow to acquire that. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't know whether the United States actually administering Greenland as a territory of the United States is worth thinking about, but maybe what I think is more likely is that the Greenlanders will actually have a successful independence movement and enter into a sort of Commonwealth style relationship with the United States that you saw, for example, with the Philippines in the 1930s and 40s, and other countries, or a very close alliance, a la what the United States had with Cuba between 1900 and 1950, or 1902 and 1959. And so I think that what's more likely is that Greenland would become independent and basically look to the United States for strategic protection. And obviously, that relationship would not be one that would be economically disadvantageous for either. So I am not particularly convinced that that Greenland will become a U.S. territory, but it's far more likely that Greenland would have a successful independence movement from Denmark.
Yeah, does Greenland want that? I mean, explain that relationship between Greenland and Denmark. Do Greenlanders want independence from that little tiny nation of Denmark to the south of them?
Yeah, Denmark is about the same size as the Houston metro area. So I think it's not a very big country. It's geographically not very big. It's a little bit smaller than South Carolina. Um, I think that uh, Denmark views Greenland as part of its historic patrimony, and so the devolution, and by devolution we mean sort of giving semi-independent powers to Greenland, is a relatively new development uh, for Denmark. It's considered a constituent country of the Danish crown. Denmark's unusual because its monarch has slightly more influential power than in other Western countries. So the Danish monarchy, for example, is relatively protective of Greenland in a way that, say, the average Dane on the street isn't. The response
Mhm.
of King Frederick to Trump's comments has been to put Greenland and the Faroe Islands more prominently in the royal crest. So the monarchy views Greenland as part of the historic patrimony, and the Danish monarch is a little bit harder to ignore than, say, the monarch in a place like Belgium or someplace like that.
Well, what do you make of Canada? Obviously, a large part of the Western Hemisphere. And, the first few comments that Donald Trump has made about, making Canada the 51st state and, the tariffs that where he was threatening against Canada, which seemed to work, actually, that negotiating tactic. I think that's what he's using tariffs as. But is there a real attempt, do you think, to make Canada somehow, maybe not a state, but somehow a territory of the United
No, I
States?
don't. I don't think so. I think that Trump is probably well aware that he's just kind of blustering to move the policy needle. The United States tried to conquer Canada in 1812, and one of the things that Americans learned really fast the hard way in the War of 1812 was that Canadians don't want to be Americans. So, what I think would be better is for Trump to look at the relationship between, say, Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney that
Mm.
was active during the 1980s, sort of two great men ruling two great countries. I think it would much better for Donald Trump to push Canadians to want to be great again, rather than what you've had, which is sort of a slide into sort of this nihilist liberal democracy that they've done under Justin Trudeau. So I think that is my guess of what President Trump is doing as well. I probably very
Y-
seriously he thinks he could conquer Canada. It's a big
Yeah,
country with a large modern military. So I think that he
yeah.
knows what he's about. He's not interested in ruling Canada. He just wants Canada to be Canada again. And I think that
Yeah.
would be a much better thing for Canadians and for Americans.
Well, I know the Canadians are not happy with the high taxes and these policies that are really stifling economic growth, and I think this is why Justin Trudeau has stepped down as his party leader and is about to step down as the prime minister because, much like the United States for the past few years, Canada has become incredibly expensive to live, and it's almost unsustainable for the average Canadian, well, whichever province you happen to be in, to do that. So, what about the trade barriers right now that exist? They seem to be very difficult for the United States. The U.S. is becoming more at a disadvantage because of the cheaper goods that can come over from Canada. Do you like Donald Trump's hardline approach to this, to the Justin Trudeau's of our neighbors up north and imposing tariffs? I mean, will that force Canada, do you think, to align more closely with American trade priorities?
Yeah, my reflex is not to think tariffs are the best policy, largely because I think tariffs can make it more expensive for everybody. I think what the president wants to do, and I think what's in his heart, is to basically make affordable lives for Americans. And then if he can also help make life affordable for Canada through appropriate strategic means, I think he wants to do that. The President Trump talks a lot about tariffs. He's not been overactive in his use of them. It's one of the reasons why the economy was quite good during his first term. It was because he actually sort of let the free market, I think, do a fair amount of self correction. And I think it could do that as well with a better Canadian leader, and certainly a better American leadership, which is what I hope we're going to be getting here in the new year. And so, my guess is that tariffs, like some of his talk about geostrategic conquest, is part of bluster. It's part of the thick sort of threatenings that Americans are good at using. We like carrots and sticks, and we sometimes forget we have a stick as well as a carrot. I think that President Trump is one of the few politicians who's very
Yeah.
well aware he has a stick.
Yes,
Too. So.
he's used that stick with all sorts of in North Korea being one of the more famous. He's got a bigger button than Kim Jong Un has, so I think he likes to use that stick when necessary, in his view. I guess final question here: when you take all these three pieces together, there's this concern that Donald Trump, I think, rightfully has about the foreign interference in the Western Hemisphere. He's concerned about probably Russia in the Arctic up there with Greenland. He's concerned about China with Panama and Canada. He's concerned about, I don't know, I would say he's concerned about the many illegal immigrants who have flooded that nation are coming down now into this country from the north, amongst many other aspects of what's happening in Canada. Can you relate those concerns with what we know as the Monroe Doctrine and what the Monroe Doctrine is and what that allows?
Yeah, so the Monroe Doctrine is from the 1820s. It's a document that basically says the United States is not going to allow interference from the old world. And at that time, that meant Western Europe in the life of any country in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the United States wasn't really capable of enforcing that early on. So it was really the Royal Navy that enforced it. And the United States sort of piggybacked off Great Britain. Now the United States is the more senior partner in that relationship as far as size of the military goes. I think what when it comes down to sort of control, hemispheric control, I don't think the United States wants to make every country in the Western Hemisphere little automatons, but it's pretty clear we've ignored the Western Hemisphere to our detriment. Think of the immigration crisis at the southern border. A lot of that is because the United States hasn't paid as much attention to Latin America. The canal zone is an interesting question precisely because Venezuela is the source of
Mhm.
so much of the immigration that we have nowadays, because the United States has sort of let a dictatorship flourish there for the better part of now 10 to 15 years, going almost on 20 years in Venezuela. So I think that the Monroe Doctrine is essentially a statement of U.S. policy. Look, we're the big guy on the block. We want to sort of guarantee free government in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to even go as far as to use our military to do that. You'll hear complaints about what's called gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy is when the United States used to run, this is the beginning of the 20th century, used to run gunboats down to a country and threaten it. Hey, if you don't act right, we're going to invade or we're going to blow up, one of your, ammunition depots or something like that. And again, you have to sort of get down to the realm of practical politics. Gunboat diplomacy might not be the best thing. It might not be a perfectly moral thing, but your choices aren't gunboat diplomacy and a utopia. Your choices are American gunboat diplomacy or a rising Chinese empire, economic empire in the Western Hemisphere. I choose gunboat diplomacy. And I hope that the president will take that seriously as well.
Right. And, there's peace through strength, is what Ronald Reagan used to say. And it worked with the then Soviet Union. And, who knows? I mean, we're really pretty much in charge. I mean, I know Mexico has more coastline when it comes to the Gulf of Mexico, but we're providing the security of the Gulf of Mexico. And I think I don't know what's going to happen if it'll be called Gulf of America. But the point being that these are national security issues. And it's time, I think, that we take those much more seriously than we have over the past 15, 20 years. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time. Congratulations on a new semester at Hillsdale College, and we wish you all the best.
Tom.
Dr. Miles Smith IV, Assistant Professor of History at Hillsdale College. Good to see you, Doctor. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so good. The whole Monroe Doctrine thing, the principles of that, keeping foreign powers out of the Americas. That's the gist here. And the foreign powers are in the Americas right now. And this is foundational to protecting United States sovereignty. And sovereignty for the United States isn't bad, just like everyone seems to support the sovereignty of other nations. But when it comes to American sovereignty, they think that's somehow not a good thing. It's, I don't know what it is, racist. One of the things that's often, alleged because we want national sovereignty. So Donald Trump's emphasis on Panama, on Greenland, Canada, I think it just reinforces this doctrine in a modern context, right? It's not so much Western Europe we have to be concerned with as they were back in the 1800s. It's Panama, it's South and Central America, it's what's happening in Canada, and the real threat in the Arctic. And I think this bringing this whole issue back up, it reinforces the Monroe Doctrine in this context, and it challenges China right now and Russia's attempts to encroach on these areas that are critical to the United States. And ignoring these threats is not an option for a country that values its independence and strength. And if we don't do something, this is my concern, personally speaking, if we don't do something about Greenland and the Arctic area, well, Russia and China will. So those are kind of the options here. So if we have I think a sophisticated argument and disagreements on these issues, we have to take the whole context of what's really concerning about the Arctic. And then, that's its own issue, not to mention Panama and what's happening in Canada. And so there are some real threats that are real, and they're in this hemisphere and they're in this country as we speak. Okay. Let's talk about the threats on Capitol Hill in these Senate confirmation hearings. Pete Hegseth's Senate confirmation hearing yesterday, it was a spectacle of a lot of division, sharp division, and staunch defense, and a lot of show, as you might imagine. I want to show you some of the top moments of yesterday's hearing before the Senate committee, as reported from Sky News in Australia.
Donald Trump's defense secretary nominee Pete Hegseth was grilled over sexual assault and aggressive drunkenness allegations by members of the Senate Armed Services Committee at a hearing to confirm his nomination. The former Fox News host came out fighting against relentless questioning by Democratic senators in a measured performance that humiliated his opposition. Elizabeth Warren was ridiculed by the audience when Pete Hegseth delivered the perfect response to her question.
In other words, you're quite sure that every general who serves should not go directly into the defense industry for 10 years? You're not willing to make that same pledge?
I'm not a general, Senator.
You'll be the one, let us just be clear, in charge of the generals?
Hegseth then slammed the inflated bureaucracy of the Biden administration in the area of defense.
Bloating. What are you going to do about that?
Senator, we're going to address that. We won World War II with 7 four-star generals. Today we have 44 four-star generals. There's an inverse relationship between the size of staffs and victory on the battlefield. We don't need more bureaucracy at the top. We need more warfighters empowered at the bottom. So it's going to be my job working with those that we hire and those inside the administration to identify those places where fat can be cut so it can go toward lethality.
Hegseth then owned Senator Mazie Hironie after she peddled unproven anonymous allegations.
No. Multiple false anonymous reports peddled by NBC
Do you
News
know that
run directly
on the job
contradictory to
is
the dozens of men and women at Fox News Channel who I work with
I'm not
who came
hearing
on
the
the
answer to my
record
question.
and said they
In your
never
opening
see
statement,
that.
Mr. Hegseth,
This commentator blasted the senator for her confused line of questioning. She said Mazie Hironie might be the least intelligent member of Congress, and that's saying something. This line of questioning is unbecoming of her position as a United States Senator. I stand with Pete Hegseth. Senator Kristen Gillibrand then had a total meltdown about the role of women and trans people serving in the military.
In the DOD, everything you've said in these public statements is politics. I don't want women. I don't want moms. What's wrong with a mom, by the way? Once you have babies, you therefore are no longer able to be lethal. I mean, you're basically saying women after they have children can't ever serve in the military in a combat role. It's a silly thing to say. It's a silly thing to say, beneath the position that you are aspiring to. To denigrate LGBTQ service members is a mistake. If you are a sharpshooter, you're as lethal regardless of what your gender identity is, regardless of who you love. So please know this to be a true statement. So you say it was a political thing. You say it undermined us, social engineering. I don't know why someone having to publicly say or not publicly say who they love is social engineering. I think
Hegseth's courageous performance was widely praised, with Senator Jim Banks urging his confirmation as senator as soon as possible.
Welcome, Mr. Hegseth. You've conducted yourself very well today. In fact, so well that I believe it's incumbent upon this committee to confirm you ASAP, to get you on the job, to clean up the mess that we have at the Pentagon ongoing at this moment because of the leadership there over the last 4 years has failed us.
The response in the media was the same, with former District Attorney Janine Pirro praising Hegseth's performance.
I'm so proud of him. I really am. Look, he's going to bring the warrior culture back. And he sat there and knowing that there were a lot of things that they were going to come at him with. And he was cool, calm, steady, and prepared. Mm-hmm. And he was willing to admit what a lot of Democrats who want to take the moral high ground cannot admit. And that is, I've made mistakes. And I've made amends to my God and to my wife. And I'm good. And I'm better for it.
Even CNN couldn't help but admit Pete Hegseth crushed the hearing.
Well, in short, I think Pete Hegseth kicked their asses today. I mean, it wasn't even close. They didn't lay a glove on Hegseth. No mistakes, calm, cool, collected. I mean, before the thing even started, you had this like Code Pink, protester freak show trying to disrupt the hearing. That's the Democratic base, by the way, which probably explains why the Democrats on the committee acted in such a bizarre and unprofessional way. I was appalled at some of the way these senators handled themselves.
Yeah, I was too. But I think Pete Hegseth did a good job. He's the first the president like Donald Trump's appointees to face the Senate scrutiny, and he took the stand for his nomination as Secretary of Defense. And the hearing, I think, really underscored his controversial reputation. Of course, they had to bring up some dirt, a lot of it unproven, a lot of it he's denied, and some of it he admitted. And I think one of the great aspects of what happened yesterday is, I forget one of the senators' names, I forget his name, but he looked at the other senators asking these questions to Pete Hegseth regarding his mistakes and his adultery that he admitted he committed, and the trial that he went through with his wife, and the forgiveness that had occurred, and his, all the difficulty he went through. And the senator looked at these other senators. He goes, many of you have done the exact same thing, and I guess tried to hide it and did not own up to it, and you're divorced as a result of it. And how many people of you here in the Senate have shown up to work, to vote, drunk? And they're quiet because they know they are guilty. The difference here is that they're kind of projecting here. Pete Hegseth is a human being who's made a lot of mistakes, just like you and me. And he's had to come to terms with those mistakes. That doesn't say, to me, that says a lot about his readiness. Because what these senators, a lot of them are not willing to do is not just admit their personal mistakes, but to admit the mistakes of the past 4 years in terms of how we have approached the Department of Defense. And it is less ready now than it was prior to Joe Biden's administration because they have, this tired phrase of they've gone woke, but they have. And that has become more of a priority rather than defense readiness. In the meantime, China has a stronger Navy than the United States does right now. They have more battleships than the United States. Those are the things that Pete Hegseth wants to remedy and fix to make us, again, the most dominant military in the world in order to do what? To give LGBTQ people a chance to, pull the trigger on a weapon? No, it's to protect the United States in the best way we know possible. And it is true. Some of the senators said it's not true that we've downgraded the standards. Based on your gender, if you're a woman or a male, you have different. It is true. To qualify, you have to do far. I've read some of the things yesterday in terms of exercise and physical readiness, and so there's a difference in what's expected if you're a man or a woman. And the whole idea is like, listen. He said over, and he never said anything about mothers are bad, and Kristen Gillibrand saying those kinds of things at all. In fact, he came out and said, I love the women and I applaud them, and I'm proud of the women who are currently serving and putting their lives on the line for this country as a member of the U.S. military. So there's a lot of, if you want to call it disinformation from the Senate committee, which is expected, it always happens, but a lot of people who were supporting Pete Hegseth were there. Applause for Pete Hegseth and chants of USA, clashing against these accusations of, supporting Middle Eastern atrocities and things of that nature. Pete Hegseth is strongly in support of Israel. He emphasized revitalizing the military's warfighting capabilities. He pledged to strip away the woke policies and restore meritocracy when it comes to the military, an apolitical Pentagon. And he laid out the vision focused on deterrence, particularly against China, and border security enhancements as part of Donald Trump's peace through strength doctrine. And the critics were up there, they questioned his qualifications. They pointed to gaps in his experience with audits and acquisition reform and international security negotiations. Despite sharp Democratic inquiries, Hegseth showed, he surrounds himself with capable experts, which is how you run a Defense Department, where you are strong. You excel in those areas, and you focus on those areas where you're weak in certain areas. You surround yourself with people who are strong in those areas, and that's a sign of a great leader. And that it did broach these contentious topics like, women in combat roles and reinstating service members ousted over COVID-19 vaccine refusals. And Hegseth, he stood firm. He's vowing back pay and apologies for the affected troops while defending combat readiness over these diversity quotas that have been put in place. The personal controversies, there's past allegations of sexual misconduct and alcohol abuse, and it further fueled the contentious atmosphere, of course. And Hegseth dismissed those claims as baseless attacks. He tried to do that, and he said these are like NBC, totally unconfirmed accusations that NBC puts out there. And this was that exchange right there. She said, I'm not hearing you answer my question right now. Republican senators framed the criticisms, I think rightfully so, as political theater. So it's just the beginning. Trump's cabinet confirmation battles are just starting. That was the first go-around yesterday, and they'll be continuing today and tomorrow. So we'll get into that more in depth on Friday here on Tom Jordan Live. All right, so Joe Biden makes a strange move. A few days left in office, an end-of-term move. President Biden announced the removal of Cuba from the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. He made a deal. And the decision announced just 6 days before Biden leaves office, signals a sharp departure from the hardline stance of the previous administration, which redesignated Cuba as a terror sponsor in early 2021. Biden officials framed the move as part of a broader effort to address human rights concerns on the communist island. He says, these actions aim to restore the release of political prisoners unjustly detained since the July 2021 protests. That came out from a senior Biden administration official, and emphasizing that the Catholic Church is brokering the agreement with Havana. So maybe there's some good aspects of this. But there's concerns because they're still a communist nation, and this directive pauses some of these lawsuits tied to confiscated property under the what's known as the Helms-Burton Act. That's a measure that critics say undermines justice for Americans with claims against the Cuban regime. Meantime, Joe Biden's rescission of these Trump-era restrictions on Cuban entities raises questions about whether these changes will truly benefit everyday Cubans, or do they enrich the regime's military elite to the detriment of the citizens of Cuba. The timing, they say, is just politically motivated. Given that the incoming administration could, very quickly reverse this decision, and they probably will. Biden's been touting his foreign policy legacy, but many are wondering whether this controversial move prioritizes diplomacy over accountability for Cuba's support of groups like Colombia's National Liberation Army. It's a very violent group, and it's a dangerous group. And so a lot of questions regarding this decision by Joe Biden, just a few days left in office. Okay, that's the headlines for today. Let's get to some comments and questions. Always appreciate your time and supporting the program in this way. Let's start them up. Cameron Harris is watching them one by one here. Let's begin with none other than the engineer is back. How you doing, the engineer? Good to see you. America First believes the world is better with a strong U.S. U.S. Navy protects world trade routes. They do, and charges nothing for that. You're correct. Others want a weak U.S. because they believe the U.S. is evil and they hate this country. That's exactly it. The United States is evil, but then you got the Houthis who are blocking these trade routes in the Red Sea. Somehow that's okay to do that. There's a lot of evil out there. That is true. The United States is really not one of them. Not that the United States is perfect, but when you look at what the United States, as you rightfully point out, for free, for the protection of these other countries as well, it does benefit the United States too, but it's these trade routes, and global trade depends on the United States in many respects to protect them. Panama Canal is one area that needs to be protected, and China's growing influence down there is incredibly concerning. So yeah, thanks. Good point. The engineer, thanks so much. All right, let's bring up another one here. Harry Sakalian. Hi, Tom. Hi, Harry. Good to see you again. Thanks for having Dr. Miles Smith on to explain the history and the importance of the Panama Canal to the USA. I love the analogy of President Jimmy Carter's Sunday school foreign policy. Regards, Harry Sakalian. Yeah, I noticed that too. That was a great line that he threw out there. And it's kind of, hey, we love you. Here's the Panama Canal for $1, and we're just going to be gracious. And we're thinking, okay, what about national security? What about, these are important trade routes. We built the Panama Canal for a purpose, and now we're ceding control to the Panamanian government, which, Dr. Miles Smith rightly pointed out isn't really a country down there, and it's being overtaken. There's a lot of corruption down there. So why did we do that? I think it was a mistake. I think Dr. Smith is correct that it was a mistake, and we need to somehow reclaim some of our authority down there because it is a national security risk. Thanks so much, Harry. Good to see you. All right, let's bring up another comment here, maybe a question. Christopher Jakolski is back. Hi, Christopher. Good to see you. I hope there is a Brian Mulroney-styled statesman on the rise in Canada. Seems unlikely, but just don't know. Yeah, those were the the Ronald Reagan years. I do think this the guy, the conservative, I forget his name, Poilievre or whatever his name is. I've watched many of his comments, some of his interviews, and he's a brilliant conservative who is growing in popularity tremendously. In fact, I think he's the dominant candidate to become the next prime minister in Canada. And if he wins, if he gains that seat, I think there's going to be a pretty good turnaround in the country. The reality is there is so much that has been done to harm Canadians, not just under the Justin Trudeau years. Yes, that has been the case. And in the last, what has it been, 10 years now that he's been in office, have been really horrendous for Canadians, authoritarian. And it's a very difficult place to live now. And the taxes have always been high there, at least in my lifetime in Canada, but they've gone through the roof there. And it's a very difficult place to make a living and to survive. Not to mention the fact that the government now has the authority, apparently, because Justin Trudeau exhibited this, to freeze your bank accounts if they don't like your politics. We saw that in the big trucker convoy protesting these vaccine authoritarian mandates that were happening in Canada. And it was like after, 2 years after COVID. And it was really hurting the economy and these livelihoods. And Justin Trudeau didn't like anyone who helped their cause, so he froze their bank accounts. Wow, it was pretty tremendous what the kind of power that this type of government has over individuals was very concerning. So some of the rollback is going to be very difficult, if at all possible at all. The damage has been done in some respects. Now, there could be an ease on different areas like taxes. We hope that's the case. But yes, we hope so, and I'm with you on that. It'd be nice to have that kind of a relationship with the United States and Canada once again, like we saw under the Ronald Reagan years. Thanks so much for the comment. Let's bring up another comment here. Taz is back. Hi, Taz. Alyssa Slotkin's questioning was an embarrassment for the state of Michigan. Yeah, it was interesting because Pete Hegseth showed her respect, thanked her for her service as a CIA data analyst in Iraq at the time. But the questioning that she was saying is like, if something along the lines like, if you were given an illegal order by Donald Trump, would you enact that illegal order? And he's like, well, what are you talking about? He goes, I reject the premise that Donald Trump is going to give an illegal order somehow. It's unconstitutional. Why are you even saying that? And she said, well, I'm not speaking about Donald Trump, any president. If Joe Biden does it, it's like, well, I'm serving under Donald Trump. Clearly, you don't like Donald Trump based on all your previous statements about him. You think he's corrupt. You think he's an authoritarian, that he's unconstitutional, whatever, all these. And you're saying you're not talking about Donald Trump. So Pete Hegseth kept saying, your whole premise is skewed. Of course, no one's going to accept from anybody in power an illegal order that's unconstitutional. Of course not. So Pete was very, I think, tactical in pointing out her flawed argument, her flawed reasoning, her flawed premise on the question. What makes you think that the president is going to give me an illegal, unconstitutional order? Nobody thinks that's good, including Donald Trump. So why are you even asking that question? I think that was a good move by Pete Hegseth, and I don't think Alyssa Slotkin ever really got past that. That was one of but she was, of course, very, Alyssa Slotkin-esque and, very, stern in her questioning to Pete Hegseth. But it didn't have a lot of meat behind it, if you know what I mean. Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Last comment here. Let's bring it up. It's from Jim Chakowski. Hi, Jim. Good to see you again. The last 4 years has been a total disaster and failure. God bless Donald Trump. Yeah, it's been, if it hasn't been a total disaster and failure, it's been maybe an 80%, almost total disaster and failure. And I do believe that this was a very misguided attempt to radically change the United States of America. And Joe Biden's, even in his campaign in 2020, this was the whole point of his being in office. And whether it was him, because Joe Biden has changed seemingly a lot, or maybe this is the real Joe Biden, but there are a lot of people around him who are very progressive in terms of their far left socialist, idealistic leanings and their ideologies. And it came straight out of the World Economic Forum. Remember, Build Back Better. That was Joe Biden's campaign slogan. That is not an American slogan. That is a slogan that came from directly Klaus Schwab. And the whole point of that is to destroy the current Western societies and cultures, destroy them like down to beyond the foundation, and build again, start over, take out these Western types of societies, and let's bring in more of an Eastern or Middle Eastern or a Eastern European type of governance. And what that means is socialism. And that was the whole gist behind Joe Biden's campaign. Build Back Better is a socialist ideal. And so, and we knew that in 2020 during the campaign, but I knew it, and because if you study, these other globalist entities out there, that's what their intent was for the Americas, this hemisphere, and particularly the United States. Take away the Constitution, take away the three branches of government. This has been an ideal for decades from the far left progressives, starting before Woodrow Wilson. But Woodrow Wilson was the first real guy, the president, who was able to enact some of these bureaucracies, which were based on that kind of doctrine. So, and then it just grew from there. And so now it rears its ugly head. And now we've come to the point where a lot of Americans seem to accept this idea and this notion that the United States was founded on evil principles. So let's get rid of the whole thing and start again, and make it like what? Like the Soviet Union? Like Germany in the late 30s and 40s? I mean, what is it that you really want to do here? And I think it's beyond those things. It's globalism. Eventually, that there's one centralized power and authority in this world. Joe Biden exhibited that time and again, and that's why there are open borders. That's why George Soros is another one who has the same ideology. He does not believe there should be any borders in the United States or in any country. It should be one government, and we should all just live amongst ourselves however we see fit. And sovereignty comes from one centralized power source, likely in Europe somewhere. And people think, well, this is just, some people argue when they're trying to hide the fact, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. No, it's an ideology that most in the media now agree with. The globalism is a very, very good thing. And national sovereignty is now considered evil. And you've got to really understand what you're saying here, because what national sovereignty means is protecting the people that live in your community, in this case, a country, from the people that hate you from wanting to destroy you. And so that is national sovereignty. You have national security. You prevent people who are dangerous or who want to destroy your nation from coming in and doing what their intention is. And we've never been at a greater risk, in my view, than that happening in this country. So it does take a strong leader to push back on that globalist ideal. And Joe Biden, the people that said that he was a moderate, and I mentioned Alyssa Slotkin, she's not a moderate. The Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan and Jocelyn Benson and Dana Nessel, they're all under these World Economic Forum ideals. They've been taught in this school, essentially, that they put out there. These, World Economic Forum credentialed politicians. You see more and more of them in various states, whether it's, district attorneys general, whether they're governors and senators and members of Congress, lieutenant governors, who don't readily admit that they've been trained by Klaus Schwab, but then you really push them on it, and they finally say, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I did go through that schooling. So that's the dangerous ideology in this state, in this country, and it's pushing itself more and more. So yeah, let's go back to strong leadership, and I think we're going to get that. It'd be nice if the Western Hemisphere had that same strong leadership. And as Dr. Miles Smith from Hillsdale College said, listen, we're the big kid on the block, so we need to provide the security for this hemisphere that keeps us all safe from threats internally and abroad as well. Let's bring up one more comment since we have a moment here, and then we'll go from there. Jim Chikowski, Bush 41 was for one world government, totally different from Ronald Reagan policies. He was. And I remember that very well. George H.W. Bush and he was Ronald Reagan's vice president. They were at odds. Yeah, they were both Republicans, but they ran against each other. They were quite severe in the 1980 campaign, and then Bush was losing, so they made an agreement somehow that he would be the VP. But he definitely was part of this, and I think that's why the Bush family right now despises Donald Trump. They can say things regarding his rhetoric, his comments, but Donald Trump is a populist. Donald Trump is a nationalist. He cares first and foremost about what's best for the country in which he is leading and what's best for the citizens of that country. It's America First policies. It doesn't mean America only, like no one else matters. But as a leader of if you're the CEO of a company, let's say it's General Motors, and you're the CEO of General Motors, are you going to really accept the notion that, well, you want, Ford or Stellantis to be more successful than you? So you're going to give up all your competitive advantages here? You're going to reveal your trade secrets to those competitive countries? You can call them enemies in this context here. No, you're not going to do that. That would be ridiculous. It would be to the detriment of your employees and to your company and to your stakeholders. You would never do that. It's the same thing with the country. What you care first and foremost is the people within your country as the leader of said country. And Donald Trump says, listen, I would expect the same thing with China. China's first concern is their country. What's best for them? But because of that, and because they hate us, our concern is not what's best for them, it's what's best for us, because they want to destroy us. So let's protect ourselves from China. And that does mean decoupling ourselves from the economic leverage that they seem to have in so many respects. And renewable energy is one way where they have dominance in the whole industry when it comes to electric vehicles and the chips and all that kind of semiconductors and whatnot. So anyway, great point. Thanks for allowing me to kind of banter a little bit about that and share my thoughts. It's always a real privilege to be here. Thank you for your time and taking the time to watch and comment and ask questions and listen. We'd appreciate you sharing the podcast as well. God bless you. Got another great show coming up tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern. It's TomJordanLive.com. Thanks so much.